when I did my introduction, I explained that our first client was back in 2003, Mozambique. That was our first mining cadastre project. Toby, together with another developer and then joined by Jonathan, started writing the first code, the first lines of code of what was then FlexiCadastre. Toby's still with us, and FlexiCadastre is now Landfolio, but we've got the same team behind it. Toby is our senior propeller head within the organisation. He leads the technical side of the design of Landfolio, and it's great how over the years him and Nick have transformed the development team with both of their skills and specialities. With Nick coming aboard into the head of R&D, it's freed Toby up to do his propeller head stuff, and one of the responsibilities there is every year to talk us through what's new in Landfolio. So Toby, over to you.
Thanks, Bill. Just a sound check. Too far? Can you hear me? This is good? Not this close. Okay, cool. All right, we'll go for here. Good afternoon. Geez, okay, maybe not that much. I'll stand back here and project rather. Is that all right? Okay. Good afternoon. It's great to be here at another Landfolio User Conference. It's been a quiet couple of years with global pandemics and things like that, but it's really, really great to see people face to face, make the connections, and particularly for the R&D team to see the real users of our software and to understand the real impact that what the product that we build actually has in the world. So really, very, very nice to see you. Thank you. So we've seen a couple of good presentations this morning on the Botswana public portal and the underlying technology, Landfolio framework, that underpins it. But it's important to understand that that framework product is essentially a user interface layer on top of our existing Landfolio product, okay? Which these days more and more often is referred to as back office, just as a way of distinguishing it from the portal product. Okay, it uses the underlying technology of Landfolio back office. And so this afternoon, I'm here to tell you a little bit more about what's new in the back office product. Okay, it's still a foundational part of our product suite and core to the way the whole system works. So we're actively developing it and actively maintaining it. So I'm just going to have a look at some of the new features that have been added in some of the recent versions, 7.2, which came out last year, 7.3, which came out at the beginning of this year, as well as a sneak peek at some of the functionality coming out in 7.4. The 7.4 engineering work is essentially done now, and we go into a period of QA, where we spend a lot of time testing and regression testing the software, dealing with any issues that come up before we finally make the product generally available a little bit later this year. So I've divided the talk up into a handful of themes that just kind of group some of the more interesting new pieces of functionality. I'm not going to go over everything that's new because we'll be here all day and not everything is interesting to everybody, but these are going to be some of the slightly more interesting things that are generally applicable. All right, so we'll start by looking at structured data. I think if I click on that, there we go. So structured data is an interesting one. Can I get a quick show of hands, how many people are familiar with and use structured data in Landfolio at the moment? Okay, not a lot of hands. Okay, that's kind of what I expected. It's relatively new functionality, and so because of that, I'm going to start with a very quick introduction to what actually is structured data, because if I tell you what's new and you don't know what it is, it's not going to help you. Okay, so let's have a quick look at, first of all, what is structured data. And if you permit me, I'll tell you a story. And it goes back to what Bill was just saying about how we started 20 years ago in Mozambique with our first project for what was then FlexiCadastre. So in the beginning, there was a license. And the license had a code, because you've got to be able to uniquely identify your licenses. And it was good. But then we had another client, and the client said to us, that's very nice, but while the government issues a license code, internally we refer to that license by a different name. So please could we record a name along with the code? And we said to the client, that's a very good idea. And so we did it. And we were very proud of ourselves. Then we had another client that said, well, actually, in our jurisdiction, when the user applies for a license, they don't get a license code immediately. First, there's an application number, and only once the license is granted do they get a code. So please can we have a field where we can record the application number? And we said, good idea, and we added it. Then we had a client who said, well, we have exploration licenses that can get converted into mining licenses. And when they get converted, they get a new code. But we still want to record the old code for historic purposes, so please could we have that? And we said, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So we added a field where you can record the old code on a license. Then we had a client, and we said, whoa, okay, this is getting silly. We can see where this is going. Every jurisdiction has another piece of information that they need. It's not necessarily the same for every jurisdiction. If we carry on like this, we're going to have a list of 100 different fields, and the interface is going to be a mess, and we still won't have properly catered to what everybody wants. So we came up with a new concept, which we called reference codes, where you can make up the name for your own piece of information that you need to store, and then you can get your users to store it with a type of reference code, a string, which is the value, the code, or whatever it may be. And we thought we're very clever. We'll even add a date, because we know sometimes people need to record a date along with that. So we introduced reference codes, and it was good. So here's an example where maybe we've got an implementation where they've set up 3 different types of reference codes. One is called a tax reference number, another is a conversion code, whatever that may be, and another is an inspection ID, as an example. Okay, and they could set that up without any other implementation of Landfolio needing to know what those things are or care about it. We found that reference codes weren't always good enough, because sometimes there's more information that needs to be captured along with it. We found that we had already built something called conditions for agreements that could capture other types of information, some numeric information in there as well. So we thought, actually, if we put conditions on licenses as well, it gives our users some more places to be a little bit more flexible about the information they put in there. But really, conditions were mostly focused on legal agreement conditions, and they weren't necessarily that well suited to other types of information. If we have a look at actions, it's a similar story. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but with actions, we have reference numbers, we have accounting codes, we have decision results. These are all places that we can try and store information about that action. We very soon came to the realization we needed reference codes on actions as well, for very similar reasons. And in fact, we also added something called statistics for people who needed to record things like production statistics, okay? How much ore was mined, when that happened, what the dollar value of it was. Then people started saying, yeah, statistics are great, but we need to record the commodity associated with the statistic, because the production for gold is different from the production for the platinum group elements, or whatever it may have been, right? So we started to expand on statistics as well. And then a client said to us, no, okay, wait, we can see where this is going. It's good, it's better than it used to be, but it's still not as good as it could be. Okay? We need to be a little bit more generic and a little bit more flexible in terms of the types of data that people want to be able to record along with their licenses and actions. And this is where we came up with structured data. Okay? So now, in a similar way to reference codes, you can define your own types of data that you want to record, but you're no longer restricted to just recording a string or a date associated with it. You can define the actual types of data that go with that new piece of information that needs to be recorded. So if I give you an example, maybe you've got a mining license and there are regular inspections of the mine and you need to record the inspection information. You can define your own type of data in structured data called inspections. And you can define that it must have an inspection date, the record of who the inspector was, what type of inspection it was, and what the outcome was. So this is a simplistic example, but you get the idea, right? So you can define not only that there are inspections, but also what information has to be captured against each of those inspections. And you don't have to record only one type of structured data. You can record as many as are appropriate to your license. So here we've got both inspections and export records are being recorded against a particular type of license. Okay? So the export records in this case, they're recording the date, the commodity, the weight, and the dollar value of the export. Okay. And this is just a list that shows you the types of data that you can record against structured data. So the commodity, the dollar value, distances, numbers, times, all sorts of things. Okay, whatever is appropriate to your data that you're trying to set up. So here we have a screenshot that just shows what the structured data actually look like in Landfolio. You'll see we've got, somebody has set up an additional tab on the left-hand side there called Production. And against production, they've set up 3 types of structured data: investment period, production partners, and production reports, for example. So each of those 3 types of data are presented as tables, and they each have their own columns for the type of data that's being recorded with that structured data. Let's just zoom in a little bit. Here's an example. Production partners has been set up to include a partner, which is a legal entity, probably a company. Then we've got a period start and end date, and a product weight of what was produced. Okay, this is a entirely made up example, but I think it gets the idea across. Okay, so I think now, hopefully you've got an idea of what structured data is. Now I'm going to tell you what's new in structured data. Okay, so one of the first things, and this is quite exciting, is sometimes your structured data doesn't lend itself to a table. You don't necessarily want to record multiple records of data. Sometimes your structured data is, there's only one thing associated with the license. So when that's the case, you can actually configure it to display in what we call form view. Instead of a table, it takes each of the columns of the table and just puts them one below the other and presents it more like a regular form for capturing the data. What else is new? Well, previously licenses and actions were the only ones who had structured data available on them. Now agreements and groups can get in on the action too, and you can record structured data there as well. In terms of the user interface, when you are using that table view, you now have the ability to sort the data on any of the columns. Previously, and by default, the data are displayed in the order that the records were captured against the license or action. Now you can actually sort, and that's useful in data discovery, especially if you've got long lists of data. Another new type of information that you can record now against structured data is an action. Okay, so instead of just some text or a date or something like that, you can actually record a link to an action that exists within the system. This is extremely useful for things like, if I give the example I gave earlier about inspections. Maybe I've got a table of inspections, and each one can have a link to the actual inspection action that has more information about that inspection. Maybe it's got documents associated with it from the inspection and so on. So you can use it to drill down to data in other parts of the system. Okay, so that kind of covers what's new within structured data. Let's move on. We've looked at structured data. Let's look now at what's new in the search interfaces. One of the things you can now do is when searching for actions, you've got an option to search by who was the user who closed a particular action. So you see in this example, somebody's done a search for closed by Mike Silver, and then their search results show only actions that were closed by that particular user. One of the key use cases for this functionality is for when you've got a public portal. This is a way of finding actions that were closed by your public users via the portal. Okay, and that gives you the opportunity to send out email notifications, for example, to your internal users to say, hey, this action has been closed by the public user and now probably needs some sort of response from the internal users of back office. Okay. Auto-expanding sticky searches. For those of you not familiar with the term sticky search, it's just what we call the behavior of the user interface when you perform a search, whether it's a license search or an action search or whatever. If you browse away and you come back to that page, the system remembers what your search was and it automatically executes that search and shows you the results, so you don't have to do it again. All that's changed now is that if you've used the more criteria of your search, it will expand it so you can see that. Previously it was always collapsed, so some of your search criteria may have been hidden and you didn't realize they were there. So this is just kind of aids the visibility and the understanding of the search. It's just a small improvement, but I think it's an improvement in many people's lives. Also in terms of searching, and this kind of now goes hand in hand with the structured data, you can now search for records, licenses, agreements, groups, and so on, by the structured data that you've associated with them. Okay, so you'll see in the screenshot somebody's filled in some structured data that they want to search by. Let's just zoom in a little bit on that, and you can see here that they're searching for licenses, but ones that have production reports. And in this case, production reports is just some structured data that's been configured in the system. So we're searching for licenses that have production reports where the commodity is gold, or where the reporting period is after the 1st of January 2015, for example. And you can see that it's got 2 search results there that meet those criteria. So those licenses have structured data that meet those criteria. We've also expanded that search capability. We've had that for a while, but we now are able to search by all types of structured data. Previously, it was only currency, date, option list, text, and time interval. Now all the different types of structured data that you can configure are also searchable. Okay, so I think that covers it for what's new in search. Let's have a quick look at what's new now in business rules. Okay, so business rules is the kind of engine of Landfolio, where you set up how you want the system to react in response to users doing things like creating new licenses or closing actions and so on. Okay, it's the business logic of your business. What's new in business rules? A couple of things. One, you can now do copying of statistics from one action to another. So sometimes you capture statistics on an action, but you need access to those statistics later on in your workflow for calculation purposes and so on. So we've added the ability to copy statistics from one action to another. And then in a similar fashion, also again on structured data, and you'll see that there's been a lot of focus on structured data, you can now do copying of your structured data from one object to another. So this is quite a nice pattern to be able to do things like, again, I'll go back to the inspection example. Maybe you've got an inspection action, and you're going to record a single inspection on that action in structured data. But then you want to actually take the results of that and copy that onto the license so that you record all of your inspections one at a time in a single list on the license, so you can see it all in one place rather than having to go and look at each individual action where they were originally recorded. So that's quite a nice a way to collate the data and make it more visible. You can also use structured data as inputs. So if you've got numeric data in your structured data, for example, you can use it as an input to the calculation of a payment amount. If you're having to calculate a royalty payment on production, then you might need to be able to read what was the dollar value of the product out of structured data and multiply that by some value to come up with a royalty payment calculation, for example. You can also use structured data now within the criteria for your business rules. Okay, so the criteria are what we use to determine whether or not it's appropriate to run a particular business rule at a time. So in response to closing an action, you can read the structured data to confirm whether it's appropriate. So an example would be in a relocation project where we're looking at building a new mine, and people have to be relocated, and there's compensation associated with that relocation. And somebody's been out there and they've done an inspection and they've determined whether or not compensation is appropriate for this particular license. Maybe there's a structured data record for relocation inspection, and one of the fields in there is compensation value, and there's a dollar amount associated with it. We can, in our business rules, we can then read that value and say, if that value is greater than 0, then schedule a compensation payment. If it's not greater than 0, then don't bother scheduling a compensation payment because there's no payment to be made, obviously, right? So we can use the structured data as criteria for executing business rules. Okay, and then the last thing under business rules is just a small thing, but it's quite a useful thing for the UI. After executing business rules, you get a summary of everything that's changed in response. Sometimes license attributes have changed, or actions have been updated, or actions have been created in response, and it gives you a summary like this. All that we've changed now is that we've created hyperlinks on those actions so that you can just click and go directly to those new actions that were created, rather than having to say, okay, and then go search for the action that was just created. Okay, so it's a small change, but actually quite useful. Right, so that covers what's new in business rules. Let's have a look now at some of the stuff that's new in maps and shapes. Again, overlapping, a lot of overlapping here. This is how maps and shapes overlap with business rules. We've always had in Landfolio the ability to do payment calculations based on the area of a license. So you might have an application fee that is a per hectare amount, for example, right? Well, all that we've done now is we've added support for doing the same sort of thing with lengths. So previously, in the early days of Landfolio, all licenses had a shape that was a polygon only. We more recently added support for points and lines as shapes, and in response to that, we've also added the functionality to use the length of a line as an input in the same way. So you might have a license type that is specifically for the building or operating of a roadway or a pipeline, something like that, where the license is actually a shape. The license is actually a line rather than a polygon, and you want to be able to do a payment calculation based on the length of that line. Right. In terms of maps, we've, right from the very early days, had support for Esri's map services directly within the Landfolio map interface. What we've added now is support also for the Open Geospatial Consortium, or sometimes called OGC, their map services, specifically WMS and WFS, which are just two ways of serving out spatial data. So you can now consume WMS and WFS map services directly in your Landfolio map, and it can be integrated with other map services that are coming from Esri, for example, and have them just interspersed into a single map that makes sense for your users. Okay, and that also includes support for WMS and WFS services that have authentication requirements against them. Okay, staying with layers in maps, you can now, as an administrator, set the default visibility of all the layers in your map. So previously, whatever the visibility of the layers in your Esri map service were the default layer visibilities within your map. So if you went to your Esri map service and you turned all the layers on, then when the user came to that map in Landfolio, all the layers would be turned on, which is generally okay. But then when we added support for WMS and WFS, where all the layers are often on by default, now when the user added a new map service into their map, they just had reams and reams of new layers available, and they were all turned on, which wasn't necessarily appropriate. Okay, so now the administrator can preset which layers are turned on and off by default. Of course, users interacting with the map can still turn layers on and off themselves. This is just about setting up a default. So when they first arrive at the map, the appropriate layers are visible. You can also choose to entirely hide a layer. So just because it's in the Esri map service or the WMS doesn't mean you necessarily need it in your Landfolio map, and so you can hide it entirely if you want to. Okay, so that covers maps and shapes. We've got 8 minutes left. I think we're doing well. We'll have a quick look at what's new with documents. Right, this is quick and easy. The ability to email documents out of Landfolio to your users has been there for many years. We've added the ability to email those documents to companies and people who are registered within Landfolio as well. So if you've got documents that are registered in the system and you've got license parties who are in the system, you can say, oh, I need to send tick, 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 these documents please to tick, 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 those companies and people. It zips them up and sets it as an attachment and sends that as an email to them. Okay, so it's quite a useful function. But this is a manually triggered function, right? You actually choose which documents and who it's getting sent to. That's different from notifications, right? So notifications are where you have an action in the system and you configure it to automatically send an email to the appropriate parties of the license. Maybe there's an action that says a renewal needs to be made, and so you want an email notification to go out to remind people, hey, you need to renew this license, right? So that's been around in Landfolio for ages. What's new is that you can now also tell it to automatically attach documents that are on the action to that email notification if you want. Okay, so maybe there's that renewal action has got a document on it that is a renewal form or more information about how and why to renew or something like that, and you can have the system automatically attach that document to that email notification that goes out. Right, and then the last thing in documents is verifying documents with digital fingerprint. Okay, so this is particularly useful when it comes to public portals where your public users are uploading documents and they're going through Landfolio to a document repository system. They want assurance that the document that they originally uploaded is the document that is still being used within the ministry, for example. Okay, so what we do now is every document that gets uploaded through Landfolio gets it's called a digital signature, but it's not like when you sign a document. It's a signature, which is basically a way of identifying the contents of the document. And we record that signature so that we can then verify at any point that the document that's sitting in the document repository, we check its signature and we compare it with the one that we recorded when we first uploaded it, and we can verify that it hasn't changed, and this is the original document as was uploaded through the public portal, for example. Okay. Right. That's it for documents, and then we're just going to go through the last section, which is just a couple of slides about some small UI and UX enhancements. Sorry, UI, user interface and user experience enhancements. Right. The first of these is custom instructions in wizards. So you're probably familiar already with the new license wizard, which is the wizard that you go through to capture a new license into the system. And there's also a new agreement wizard similar to that. You can now put custom instructions on each step in that wizard to guide your users through the process. Okay, you might need to remind them to add, in this case, you can see the screenshot is the parties step. So somebody's busy adding a license. They're on the parties step or step in the wizard, and somebody's configured a custom instruction that says, please include both the applicant and the legal representative making the application. Okay? This particular type of license requires a legal representative, for example. Other license types maybe don't, or maybe there's a surface rights application, and you need to remember to include the current surface rights holder, right? So different license types might have different requirements, but they're all using the same wizard, and so the instructions allow you to say, okay, for this license type, this is what you need to capture on this page. Okay, and so you can set up these instructions per step of the wizard and per license type, and in fact, per template. If you're using templates in your wizards, which are a little bit more advanced than just using a license type, you can set up different instructions that are used depending on which template the user selected at the beginning of the wizard. So that's a very helpful step for guiding your users to success. Right, ordering of menu items. You've got more control now of what sits in that left-hand side menu. You can control for licenses, agreements, and groups exactly which license type groups, which agreement types, and which group types are actually visible in the menu. You don't have to have all of them in there. You can put the most commonly used ones, and you've also now got full control over the order that they sit in that menu. So you probably put your most commonly used license types at the top of the list, for example, to help guide the user to get what they're looking for fastest. Okay, it helps to declutter the menu as well. We've made some improvements to the way we display text, particularly long-form text. So there are some places where you can write a paragraph. Maybe there's a description or a comment box. The UI will now expand that text area to accommodate the long text that you're typing in there, so that you don't end up with a little box and a tiny little scroll wheel and have to try and scroll through 3 lines of text at a time looking for what you're looking for. It now displays the full amount of text, and that's both when you're editing and when you're just reading the text. So that's a nice user improvement there. Okay, and then the very last one, and this is a very small thing, but this is quite a big thing for some people, is the fact that when you do an export from Landfolio to Excel, it now generates a true Excel spreadsheet. So previously, you were able to export to Excel. What you didn't necessarily realize that under the hood was it was just taking a web page table and labeling it like an Excel spreadsheet, and Excel was happy enough to say, yeah, that's all right, I know how to display Excel, and it would show it to you in Excel, and it was fine. But there was a certain functionality associated with Excel that you couldn't use when you were just displaying HTML like that. So now what we do is we actually export a full Excel spreadsheet, so you've got the full functionality of Excel when you're working with that data, which is significantly better. And I know that Rogerio is this is the only reason he's here, is to see that we've done this and make sure we've done this. All right. I think that is now it. Yes, that's the end. So that covers everything that's new in Landfolio back office. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Toby?
You didn't mention the entity imports.
Yes, I didn't mention everything. I had to go through judiciously and choose kind of top things. Yeah. So as I said, there are many other things that we've done, but I haven't mentioned them all here today.
Any other questions? Thank you, Toby. Thanks a lot.